We welcome you to another Sunday School lesson. Sunday School is a blessing and gift from God. Equality provides value in the enjoyment of fundamental rights and freedoms, and equal opportunities with regards to education, work, and the fulfillment of one's potential. Equity relates to a degree of equality in the living conditions of people, especially in terms of income and wealth. Living below survival levels is a major cause of social tensions and threatens to divide a nation because of income inequality. Marginalization at the individual level results in an individual's exclusion from meaningful participation in society. Reduction and elimination of inequalities is God's plan that believers should participate in. Our lesson takes place during Moses' second message on proper justice as he was preparing a new generation for a new start in the Promised Land. Our lesson begins with Deuteronomy 24:10, which says, "When you make a loan of any kind to your neighbor, do not go into their house to get what is offered to you as a pledge." There would be times when a person needed a loan, and he offers something as security till he can pay back. To protect the dignity of the borrower, Moses commanded that the lender could not go into the borrower's house to take possession of his collateral. This would prevent the lender to take what he liked or something which the poor man could not spare. In Israel, lenders were allowed to take collateral as security for a loan, but they were not allowed to charge interest to make a profit. However, Moses later stated that an Israelite could lend money to a foreigner living in the land and charge them interest, but they could not charge interest to another Israelite, Deuteronomy 23:19-20. Verse 11 says, "Stay outside and let the neighbor to whom you are making the loan bring the pledge out to you." The lender had to wait outside the borrower's home and allow the borrower to bring out the pledge himself, thus keeping his dignity and respect. The borrower brings to the lender only what he could spare until the debt was paid. The old saying that a man's house is his castle, even a poor man's house, must be true because God made sure that the borrower's home was protected by the law. Verse 12 says, "If the neighbor is poor, do not go to sleep with their pledge in your possession." Anyone might have a need to borrow money from another, but Moses recognizes how a poor man's pledge should be handled. It may be that the borrower was so poor that the only thing he had to use as collateral would be his bedclothes or what he slept in. In such instances, the lender could not keep the poor borrower's bedclothes overnight. God had given this command at Mount Sinai prohibiting a lender from keeping a neighbor's bedclothes overnight, saying because that cloak is the only covering your neighbor has. What else can they sleep in? Exodus 22:27. Verse 13 says, "Return their cloak by sunset so that your neighbor may sleep in it. Then they will thank you, and it will be regarded as a righteous act in the sight of the Lord your God." If the poor man's sleepwear were offered as collateral, and taken in the morning, the lender was obligated to bring them back again every evening. When the lender responded properly, allowing the borrower to sleep in his own bedclothes, Moses said that the lender could expect the borrower to not only praise him, speak well of him for it, and give him thanks, but will pray to God to bless him for such kindness shown. In addition, the lender's gracious act would be credited as obedience to God, as well as evidence of his sincere obedience to the law. Verse 14 says, "Do not take advantage of a hired worker who is poor and needy, whether that worker is a fellow Israelite or a foreigner residing in one of your towns." God gave Moses the law, that no Israelite could be sold as a slave, but they could be hired servants, Leviticus 25:39-42. Directing his command to masters or employers, Moses said they must not oppress a hired servant by overloading them with work, by giving them unreasonable rebukes, or by withholding from them proper care. This included foreigners who lived among the Israelites as bondservants. Verse 15 says, "Pay them their wages each day before sunset, because they are poor and are counting on it. Otherwise they may cry to the Lord against you, and you will be guilty of sin." Moses gives instructions to masters saying they must be punctual in paying hired servants their wages. At the end of the workday the master was to pay him for his day's work, without any delays. Moses gives the reason why it was so important to pay the hired servant on time. He said because the hired servant is poor, he deeply depends on each day's pay to cover each day's needs with nothing to spare for the next day. Failure of the employer to pay his hired servant on time may cause the hired servant to cry out to the Lord against his employer, asking God for help and fairness. Because the hired servant is poor, God holds a special place in his heart for him. Moses also declared that should the master fail to pay on time, he would be guilty of sinning. Verse 16 says, "Parents are not to be put to death for their children, nor children put to death for their parents, each will die for their own sin." Family members could not be held responsible for acts committed by other family members. If the children broke the law, they and they alone should suffer for it. The parents should neither suffer for them or with them. Guilty parents should also be punished for their own sin. However, God said he would punish generations down to the third and fourth generations of those who hate him by serving other gods. God does not punish anyone for the sins of others, that would not be fair or just, and God is both fair and just. However, the children can suffer the consequences that arise from their parents' sins. Verse 17 says, "Do not deprive the foreigner or the fatherless of justice, or take the cloak of the widow as a pledge." God's people must treat fairly the foreigners living among the Israelites as well as the orphans in all situations. In addition, the people were commanded not to take a widow's clothing as a security for a loan. Doing that would also be perverting or distorting justice for those who had no one to protect them. Like all poor people, God is concerned about the stranger, the orphan and widows, and as his people we should be also. Verse 18 says, "Remember that you were slaves in Egypt and the Lord your God redeemed you from there. That is why I command you to do this." Moses reminded them that they had been mistreated as slaves in Egypt, and therefore must treat those less fortunate justly and fairly. Moses also reminded the people that the Lord brought them out of that situation, and as a result, he expected his people to do the same for the poor, the stranger, orphans and widows, those who were marginalized or on the lower levels of society. The New Testament also indicates that like the Hebrews of the Old Testament, Christians should show concern for the poor, the stranger, orphans and widows as well. Verse 19 says, "When you are harvesting in your field and you overlook a sheaf, do not go back to get it. Leave it for the foreigner, the fatherless and the widow, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands." Justice and fairness was to also be shown in agriculture. The law stated that when harvesting crops, the corners of the fields were not to be harvested, but were to be left for the poor and the stranger for their use. In cases where the farmer actually forgot a sheaf in the field, he should not go back and pick the sheaf up. It was to be left there for the poor. This would prevent the farmer from being greedy in gathering their grain, and the left behind sheaf would be provision for the less fortunate. In addition, the farmer would be rewarded because he obeys God's commands and treat the marginalized with compassion and respect. Verse 20 says, "When you beat the olives from your trees, do not go over the branches a second time. Leave what remains for the foreigner, the fatherless and the widow." When the farmer harvested olives, he would beat the olive tree branches with a long rod or stick, causing most of the olives to fall to the ground. But if after the farmer beat the branches the first time and olives still remained on them, the farmer was not to beat the branches again but was to leave the remaining olives for the stranger, for the fatherless, and for the widow. Our final verse says, "When you harvest the grapes in your vineyard, do not go over the vines again. Leave what remains for the foreigner, the fatherless and the widow." The same instructions for the olives are given to the farmer regarding the grapes. When the farmer gathered his grapes from his vineyard, he was not to gather the remains afterward. Any grapes that were left, were to be for the stranger, for the fatherless, and for the widow. May we as believers in Jesus Christ never get tired of doing good to others, but when we have the opportunity, strive to do good to all men, especially to those who are in the family of believers. If we do, rest assured that we will reap God's blessings at the proper time. Justice and the marginalized. God's love and concern for the poor and other marginalized people is evident throughout the scriptures. During this farewell message to the Israelites, Moses said there will always be poor people in the land. Therefore I command you to be open-handed toward your fellow Israelites who are poor and needy in your land. Deuteronomy 15:11. More than 3,500 years after Moses spoke his words, the world is still full of poor people and will continue to be. As Christians, our duty is to live respecting the dignity of the poor and to help them whenever we can. Although the laws given in our lesson text were directed to the Israelites, the principles behind them should be followed by everyone, especially by believers in Jesus Christ. If our Heavenly Father's compassionate and loving heart leans toward the poor, certainly ours should be as well. Justice and the marginalized. 1. As Christians, if we make personal loans to others, we must treat them justly and fairly and demonstrate integrity when collecting the debt. Deuteronomy 24:10-13. Care for others includes seeking that even our debtors be treated justly. 2. If we are employers, we should never take advantage of our employees, and always pay them on time. Deuteronomy 24:14-15. Employees who are paid on time will also be more motivated to perform better. It gives them an incentive to do more and go above and beyond when needed. 3. Each individual is responsible for his own sins. Deuteronomy 24:16. The Creator put awareness in the heart and conscience, expecting each of us to take personal responsibility and accountability for our actions. 4. Those in positions of judgment should never distort the justice of poor and needy people, considering that they could be in the same condition. Deuteronomy 24:17-18. Justice is relational people living in right relationship with God, and with one another. As God is just and loving, so we are called to do justice and live in love. 5. If we ever have more than we need, it's God's will that we share with the poor and needy instead of throwing the excess away. Deuteronomy 24:19-21. Whoever is kind to the poor lends to the Lord, and he will reward them for what they have done. Proverbs 19:17. We are truly glad you spent time to learn this lesson with us. We hope you are blessed and may share these with somebody else. Thank you very much, have a great week, and God bless you always, dear brothers and sisters.